Hey everybody, and welcome to the show. For me, this is a really big one. I got the pleasure of having Martin Popoff today. So let me tell you a little bit about Martin, if you guys aren't familiar. Martin Popoff has written somewhere between 85 and 90 books, all about hard rock and heavy music. He is just a very, very prolific writer. He's written a whole bunch of stuff. He's written a ton of interviews as well on different bands we all love. He's got tons of stories, tons of information. I call him the heavy metal encyclopedia. So without further ado, here he is. Hey, Martin, how are you, sir?
Hey, doing okay, Walter. Thanks for having me. This is very cool.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this.
All right.
Absolute pleasure. We were talking a little bit off air, and I was giving you a little bit of a heads up. So what I do with the show usually is I go chronological. I start at the beginning.
Yeah.
So uh, I know that you started off as your love of music. Well, let's talk about that. What was the band that sort of first kind of lit the fuse that you're like, man, I really like this. I will really want to get involved with this thing.
Boy, I would say it's weird. Like we joined the Columbia Record Club. I'm from Trail, BC, right? Little small town in BC, just north of Spokane, Washington, which figures big in the story because that's where I would go and buy all our
Right.
new wave of British heavy metal records and all that, and saw my first concerts. But so I remember getting Three Dog Night Live and Creedence Clearwater Revival Pendulum and Steppenwolf Gold and kind of liking it and thinking, oh, this is cool. But then it was more like, okay, I've discovered my music when, it was, I think, maybe Led Zeppelin 4 and maybe Nazareth Razamanaz, some Deep Purple, some
Right.
Black Sabbath. So as soon as I heard those heavy sounds, BTO, I remember being a super
Oh man,
first
love
BTO,
BTO.
second BTO. Um,
Yeah.
so that's the stuff that really got me going. And then, we had a couple other buddies in town and we quickly became, little young punk, angry metalhead experts by about, so I'm 57. So I was 12 in 1975. I was fully woke by
Right. Right.
1975, but I was pretty woke even but by 74, I would say.
Very cool. So okay, so and I from reading your bio, did you form a band with these kids, or was that sort of later on where you started trying to play some of the
No,
music you
I
love?
wasn't. I had a band, and we were like a short-lived professional band in the '80s. Like just played the bars for like a summer and a little bit or whatever. But no, I mean, but all along I did play the drums, and I played drums in school. In like high school, junior high, and so yeah, we eventually had a band. We were called Torque, and we played the bars and stuff, and we covered. I remember telling Billy Gibbons that we refused to play the big hits, but we would only play the two heaviest songs off of Eliminator, which was Bad Girl and I Got the Six, I believe it was called.
Right.
And we covered Bluish Occult and Max Webster and UFO and Budgie, and we played a Clash
Wow.
song and U2 New Year's Day and Bluish Occult The Vigil, probably the hardest Bluish Occult song to play. We did that one. Judas Priest, Quiet Riot. So, but no, I was a I quickly abandoned that. I never took it that seriously.
Okay, so so because I mean, usually that when folks have a real love for music, they usually that's what they do. It's like I'm I love this music. I'm going to form a band and do it myself. So, but you did that for a while, but then you got into writing books. So, how did that first begin? What got you interested in writing?
Yeah, I mean that was way later. There was no plan to do that. I was just a crazy, knowledgeable fan for all those years. I started at 30 years old. I mean,
Oh wow!
yeah, I did a self-published book of record reviews called Riff Kills Man, 25 years of recorded hard rock and heavy metals. It had 1,942 record reviews. Then quickly met Tim Henderson when I moved here to Toronto, and he was running the heavy metal department in HMV, the big flagship store, right? Huge metal department. And then he was breaking away from Drew Masters and Meat Magazine and starting his own thing. So by 94, we started Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles, like literally pasting it together on my photocopier that I had. Um,
Right.
So we got the magazine going. So by 94, that's when I started interviewing bands and reviewing and getting sent free CDs and all this stuff. So quickly, you know, I was immersed in, you know, it was almost looking like a magazine really by 94, 95, 96. And it just got better and better. And we were just interviewing and reviewing tons of bands. So it took off from there. And then that first book got republished through a publisher and greatly expanded in 97. And then it's just been a book or two to start out. And then literally it's been, you know, 8-9 books a year for the last few years.
So yeah, your output is like insane. you,
yeah, I mean, it looks like a lot, but it's like what I tell people is, you know, I'm one of the rare people where just doing these books now is my full-time job. I mean, a lot of people have all sorts of stuff besides writing the books that they do, but now and then 10 or 15 years ago, there was the magazine and a lot of website stuff and liner notes, but all of that has fallen away with all the changes in technology. So I really am down to like and I've done a lot of work at Banger Films right over the years, and some years
get into that, yeah.
But literally for say even the last 2 years, I would say, you know, 90% of my time is literally just cranking out books and repurposing old books and stuff like that, like updating and expanding them. So, you know, when all that other stuff falls away and you're left with, as one of the few guys that literally is just kind of trying to write heavy metal books for a living full time, it's not that hard to get this much stuff done. So I suppose you have to be a fast writer, of course, too. If I'm super slow, like I know some slow writers and I know that they could never do this, but so yeah, all that stuff combined, it's not really like a Herculean task, really.
Right. Okay, look, I just want to greet some of the folks in the chat, say hello, and then we'll get right back into this. I got let's see who we got here. We got Fruitcake Tony's in the house. We got Bruce, welcome. Hank Hill, nice to see you. Hurricane Moon, Terry Himes, Jeff Miller, Daniel Horsley, welcome, guys. There's Janice, Isaac, Gabriel Valbueno. There's a new name. Welcome to the channel. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. Daniel Horsley is with us. BC Rich 581, Brian Landreth, Jimmy Biter. Oh yeah, just going down. Lars Guitars, welcome. Bent Tom, awesome. If you folks have any questions for Martin, please tag me at the chat and I will forward those to Martin, by the way. Okay. All right, Isaac is saying hello to both of us. Hello back, Isaac. Shake Your Guitar Tutorials, welcome. Great Vanzini is with us. Just going down. Rick Hefner, welcome. Mitch Heyman, Ricky Compton, Dale Palmer. All right. BV Ninja, how are you? Brad Miller, Papa Blue. All right, folks. If I missed your name, please tag me in the chat. We got a lot of folks in here, and please bring on the questions. I don't think there's many people on the planet that have as much information as Martin does on heavy metal or hard rock. So I want to go back a little bit. So back in those late 70s, early 80s, in terms of publications, I mean, you had Circus and you had Hit Parader. And there wasn't a lot, like, I'm just speaking about my experience living in Toronto, like these other bands that were all popping up in England and that whole sort of rise of heavy metal, we really didn't get exposed to that. And when you went to the music stores, and I'd go down, and I mean, you're from Toronto, so these stores don't exist anymore, but there used to be a Sam the Record Man. And you go to the import section, that's the only place you would see these things, but you wouldn't see these things in large print anywhere, until Kerrang came out. And that was the first magazine that came out, and now you're looking at all these bands and you're hearing these names for the first time. So in your experience, how did you get exposure to that whole genre, which really we'll talk about, we can get into when heavy metal started, but I'm thinking more in terms of like late 70s, early 80s.
Well, the big correction is before Kerrang, all of that heavy metal content was in Sounds. So there was a UK newspaper, black and white newspaper, Sounds. In the UK, they had these big competing newspapers, Melody Maker, the New Musical Express, Record Mirror, Sounds. And Sounds was the one, they all were pretty excited about this new metal thing coming up, late 79 into 80. But Sounds was the one that had most of the coverage. They really loved this stuff. So Sounds was big into metal through 80, 81, and Kerrang '82, early '82, I think the first issue, Angus on the
Yeah.
cover, I believe. But
Yes, right. Yes.
yeah, so I was in a small town, Trail, BC, directly 2 hours south of Spokane, Washington. That's where we had Strawberry Jams, Eucalyptus, Magic Mushroom, all our great hippie head shop record stores.
Right.
And they had all the import LPs, singles, and they always had sounds and Kerrang and Melody Maker. So we would buy those ones. And then, of course, on top of the ones you mentioned, there was also Cream magazine, of course. And then when Kerrang started up, Circus, certainly Hit Parader went way more metal, and Circus went more metal, and Cream, started to put in a little more metal too. So you suddenly had a fair bit. I mean, Metal Forces started pretty early on as well, 84-ish, 83. Yeah, out of Toronto here, we eventually had Metallion, 84, 85, right? And then Meat came along about 87, 88. So Meat Magazine was a great resource. Drew Masters, good buddy of mine, that was 88, 87 to about 90, 93, 94. And then Tim and I started up with Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles. And Tim's always been the boss, and he's ran with it and started bravewords.com really early. Like, we were up and running and pretty serious by about 96, 97. It was really when the internet started, right?
That's right, yeah.
To me, the internet started in 96, essentially. That's when things really, took off, or didn't even take off. Like, that's when the hockey curve started, right? But 97, 98, and now Brave Words is, that's Tim's full-time job, and it has been for years and years and years. We stopped print in 2008, 113 issues, I think we had.
Wow.
But yeah, there were a lot of magazines, and then the States had all sorts of indie magazines coming up soon as metal was getting big around 84, 85. So you had quite a few resources after a while.
The first heavy record that I remember seeing in a store that I knew that in a music shop that I knew that this is a heavy album was the first Metallica record. And around that time, I was seeing bands like Man of War, but I wasn't, I don't know. I was more into the sort of the hard rock. And then there's always that thing, like where does hard rock end and where does heavy metal begin? Because in the mid 80s, I was listening to, like we mentioned off air, I'm a huge Kiss fan. I was into the Kiss, and then the Motley Crue, and then the Quiet Riots, and all that sort of thing. And, the only time I was really getting my foot wet in what you would call heavy metal was really Judas Priest, which is like my favorite 80s metal band. Right. Anvil, or not Anvil, sorry, Accept, and all of these types of bands. So when in your experience, like when did you decide, where you went? So, because the first bands were really, I would consider more hard rock. When did you decide to go or get a taste more for the heavy metal? And what was your gateway? I'm thinking it was probably Sabbath. Am I correct?
Yeah, interesting question. So I would say in the 70s, Sabbath was the heaviest all along. Your Deep Purples, your Uriah Heeps. But basically, the big change was, I remember as kids, we had this crazy rating system. I won't go into it, but basically Rainbow Rising, 1976, was the first album we ever bought that had no ballads on it. It was 6 totally heavy songs. And then also that year, Judas Priest, Sad Wings of Destiny completely kicked everything up a notch. So those 2 albums were important. The Sex Pistols album was important. It was really heavy.
That's a great record.
Then Motörhead came along, and they were a totally new kind of heavy,
right.
Recording badly on purpose, no ballads again, gruff vocals. And then very quickly you were into the new wave of British heavy metal. And it's funny you mentioned Metallica, because I always have a little sermon I give that's the first metal album as opposed to heavy metal. But the first heavy metal that felt like, and we did this with Banger when we did Metal Evolution. We did kind of a whole episode on this. But the first time you had heavy metal as a multi-sensory experience where what was on the tin is what was inside. You mentioned you looked at Metallica that way with that Kill 'Em All. Well, we looked at Iron Maiden that way with a ghoulish illustrated monster on the cover, right? Because basically before Iron Maiden and before Judas Priest brought on all the leathers and bikes and stuff, right? All the bands basically looked like hangovers from the hippies, right? Black Sabbath looked dressed like the Eagles, dressed like Foghat, dressed like REO wagon, dressed like Judas Priest before they discovered the leather. So, and the album covers were trying to be basically arty and non-committal to being heavy metal. But what happened was, you got Judas Priest calling a record British Steel. You had Iron Maiden with the Ghoul on the cover. You had Saxon, Wheels of Steel. You had Biff Bifford talking about how proud he was to be a metalhead. You had, if there were ballads, they were more like funereal dirges now. They weren't love songs, right? So basically 1980 is and we just did an episode of Lockhorn's Redux or whatever, a recent episode with Banger TV on what was the most important year in heavy metal. And I argued 1970, 1980, 1986 possibly, but 1980 sort of won because that is the year, as Biff Bifford says, the year the dam burst, right? And the band's playing on and all this stuff. So that's when you got basically a whole package, and you got basically songs about heavy metal and people being proud to be heavy metal and not apologizing it or even trying to hide it in some way anymore. That's when the whole package became heavy metal, 1980.
All right. So if you were to, summarize where the break from hard rock to heavy metal, like what would make one band hard rock and one band heavy metal?
Well, so that's another interesting question, because we've also been doing these things on Banger TV where we pick the top 5 heavy metal albums of 1975, 76, 77, 71.
Right.
70.
That's why I know.
The point is that when there wasn't much to go around, see, that was the great thing about the new wave British heavy metal. Before that, you could count the number of heavy metal albums on 3 friends' hands, right?
Right, right.
I mean, bands anyway. So basically, if you're sitting there in 1976, Kiss, Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, Blue Oyster Cult, they're all heavy metal bands. There's nothing heavier, right? I mean, it's really heavy for the day. So as you move on in time, Ted Nugent has to necessarily fall away because he's not as heavy anymore. So now you're talking about hard rock or whatever. But back in the old days, there was really no distinction between hard rock and heavy metal. That wasn't a debate. That basically came up more so post, as you say, Walter, like Metallica, basically 1983, when we started to get thrash and then death and Slayer and stuff like that. And then you had hair metal, really, really, pristine vocals and pristine production values, and they looked like girls and all this stuff and the makeup. That's when you started having that debate. Well, is this even really heavy metal anymore? Because there's this other stuff that's comparatively way, way heavier. So that's why Metallica Kill 'Em All is important, because I remember getting that album as a new release, and that was the first time where you heard someone singing that gruff and that angry, and it was all about the riffs, and there were some really fast songs, and they were fast and tight. They weren't fast and loose like Motörhead. So that was the birth of thrash right there. July 1983, Metallica Kill 'Em All. That was a change in itself. But yeah, to answer your question with a short answer, it really didn't become a debate until we had lots of flavors of heavy metal.
So what I was going to suggest to that is, for me, the break seems to be where like hard rock still has a lot of blues in it, and heavy metal is like there's no blues.
Well, I think I would almost disagree in that later on, when the debate became big, it was more like hard rock had a lot of melody and pop in it. Way in the early days, that's a whole different debate. Like, who still has vestiges of the British blues boom in them, right?
Right.
You come up through Free and Led Zeppelin into Bad Company into Foreigner. You've got still a bunch of blues in there. But I always maintain, like, I always have this fight with people. Like, people say, "Oh, Black Sabbath was just a blues band. They were a blues band when they were Earth for like 1 year, and they're a blues band for like 30% of the first album, but then the blues, they're over with it." And the point is that everybody got really sick of the British blues boom and was looking for something heavier. And true heavy metal, when it was birthed in 1970, basically leaned more on classical music than anything. So you had the big 3, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, Black Sabbath, where it was doomy and classical, and there really wasn't much blues in it anymore. That was the big break. So that's where the blues part is. But yeah, to put a fine point on it, when you actually start debating about it, it's more pop and hooks. But true to what you're saying, though, in the late 70s, those bands still had a lot of blues in them. Like Aerosmith was America's
Yeah.
Answer to the Rolling Stones. Ted Nugent came from You Love It Is Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley and blah, 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 right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Kiss had, I do an episode of my podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, where I talk about the A-B switch between boogie and modernness. And you hear that in a song like Kiss Strutter or Montrose Rock the Nation, where you hear modern riff, boogie, modern riff, boogie. And that's where you slowly start moving away. Mountain and Cactus are again, some of that connective tissue between those ones. So yeah, to me, true heavy metal is born when the blues is taken out of it, when we say we're fed up with this, there's too many rules in the blues. And then metal, what they call metal, not heavy metal, is born with Metallica Kill 'Em All.
All right, so there's another distinction that I wasn't even aware of: the separation of heavy metal and metal.
Yeah.
So when did the heavy start? When did the heavy start and when did the heavy go away? With Metallica? So what is it about? You're talking about the first record, I'm assuming, the Kill 'Em All, right?
Yeah.
So what makes that metal and no longer heavy metal?
Well, again, it's the huge reliance on riff and how important the riff is. It's the good production values. What I'm doing right now is defining thrash, right? It's fast, but it's super tight. The palm muted, like the machine gun riffing, the angry, shouty vocals rather than the high screaming Rob Halford vocals. And then quickly, thrash gets defined simply by having other albums added to it, like the second Metallica, Ride the Lightning, the first Anthrax, Fistful of Metal, the first Slayer, Show No Mercy, the first Megadeth comes along. So soon you have a little scene. There's no death metal yet, but you have this scene of thrash, which is a morphing. It's basically saying we want to do everything heavier than the new wave of British heavy metal. That's what it is. They threw down the gauntlet and said, we want to be heavier than every new wave of British heavy metal band, which had only been around for 2.5 years at that point, right? But basically, we're going to be heavier than all those bands. And there's a few odd exceptions that are, like hard to categorize, like Venom, Motörhead, Venom, Warfare, Tank, that dirty new wave of British heavy metal thing. And then you had the really doomy stuff with Angel Witch and whatnot. But no, basically metal is born with Kill 'Em All, July 1983.
So the first, because I know then when you start talking about metal, that there's a ton of genres of that as well. So would it be safe to say then, if we're basing this on the first Metallica record, that the first genre of metal would be thrash? Is that a safe statement to say? To make?
Well, boy, that's an interesting question, because people consider new wave of British heavy metal a genre. Doom metal, basically, Black Sabbath invented something, and they even kind of were called doomy all along. But if you want to say, where does doom metal begin? Well, that begins with Witchfinder General. Progressive metal, Rush invented progressive metal, but soon you had the likes of Queensryche and Fate's Warning, and even people called Judas Priest and Iron Maiden progressive metal bands. You had boogie metal, you had Foghat and Status Quo and ZZ Top. So genres did exist before, but yeah, it's interesting. I guess come to think of it, there really weren't that many of them. Hair metal started at exactly the same time as thrash.
Yeah.
So you have that right away too.
Going back to what I was saying, so like I'm in a music store, and I mean there's the Motley Crue record, and they're all done up as Motley Crue did, and then there's the Metallica Kill 'Em All. Talk about polar opposites, right? At the time, I bought the Motley Crue record. I didn't get or understand Metallica until I was in college. And I had a buddy of mine who kept saying, man, you got to listen to Metallica. You got to listen to Metallica. And I'm like, I can't get into that stuff. No, you got to listen to it. And he loaned me Ride the Lightning. Holy shit.
Yeah.
That blew my freaking mind. It's like, okay, I'm into this band because, like the riffs, Trapped Under Ice. Like, I mean, oh my God, like this stuff's, and then you start to go back and then Kill 'Em All, the record that I didn't buy, 3-4 years earlier, picked that up, and then and Justice for All, which unfortunately the production is shit, but it's too bad because there's some pretty good riffs on that. Right up, I was good with Metallica. I'll go as far as the Black record, and then I unplugged from it, and I have been unplugged ever since. but that's a whole other thing. Every band has their sort of their golden age, you know, and their points where you connect and disconnect, and that's where I disconnected with Metallica,
Yeah.
you know. But the band that carried through for me all through that the Motley Crues and all that, that was the one of the first bands that came out and said, you know what, we're a metal band and we're proud to be a metal band. That was Judas Priest.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm saying, I know your favorite records because I've watched your reviews and such on Banger, and I know you're not a huge fan of it, but Screaming for Vengeance for me, that was like the icing. That's like the icing of the cake. That record is absolutely fantastic, you know. And that's the band that kind of the heavy metal band that kept me going all the way through. Iron Maiden was another one.
Yeah.
Now, but Iron Maiden was kind of, you almost had, I won't say, they're almost like they were the same band, but when they brought in Bruce Dickinson, it sort of took a completely different twist to the music. I mean, not a lot, but you know what I mean. It's not like two bands. It's sort of like the AC/DC when Brian Johnson came in. You know what I mean? It sort of like took on another life.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I mean, I basically I always say that all the first 5 Iron Maiden albums, let's see, first 4 Iron Maiden albums are all completely different from each other. And 2 of them are with Paul and 2 are with Bruce. And then they basically found their sound, production sound with Martin Birch, but certainly Nico McBrain was a big part of their sound. And then they've kind of stuck with their sound right till today. I mean, they have really, I really don't think they've changed very much, starting with Peace of Mind. But it did, you're right. I mean, it totally took on its life of its own. Bruce was such a personality force and a vocal force, and a lyricist for that matter, that you know, they just completely took off. And yeah, so they're a new wave of British heavy metal band making good, and they're the one that's going to be the breakout band. But it's funny, again, back to these definitions. I mean, you had basically heavy metal was what Judas Priest was doing and Scorpions was doing and Iron Maiden,
Right.
to some extent Motley Crue. I mean, any band that kind of survived out of the 70s and into the 80s, you know, particularly, I suppose, the British bands were still heavy metal. And then also what you had happening very soon, you had the start of Metal Blade Records. And a lot of the bands that Brian signed, Brian Slagle, were pure heavy metal bands. And then later on, that would, in retrospect, be called true metal or original power metal or American power metal. So there was this whole traditional Dio, except, I mean, there was this whole traditional heavy metal thing that also was going the exact same time that you had over to the left, the super heavy stuff with thrash, and over to the right, the comparatively mellower, more accessible, radio-friendly stuff with hair metal. So there was lots of traditional, all forms of heavy metal basically had enjoyed great success in the all through the 80s, right?
And you can almost trace any current genre. You can trace it back to maybe a song or an album. That's sort of the term I hear a lot is proto. To the proto metal, like for example, you know, thrash. I was saying earlier, you know, that you could trace that back to Motley Crue, or not Motley Crue, sorry, Metallica. You could trace, you know, the doom metal. You can trace that back to Black Sabbath. You know what I mean? It's all these, and I don't know. What about, because Led Zeppelin gets thrown into this mix a lot, you know. And some people say that they're partially responsible for heavy metal, and some people say that they're not. I mean, I can see the connection in terms of like the heavy riffing, you know, like the Heartbreakers, and for example, you know, or the Whole Lot of Love, you know, as being, you know, that sort of maybe informing future generations of playing those heavy riffs and making that the centerpiece to their songs, right? Would you consider would you consider Led Zeppelin a big contributor to heavy metal, or were they just a loud blues band?
Well, here's where that's kind of the point, but here's kind of where they fit. So there's the likes of Cream and Hendrix and Yardbirds, and in America, Blue Cheer, MC5. But Led Zeppelin comes in, 2 albums before the 70s start. And the thing that Led Zeppelin is kind of known for is they made the blues exciting and wild. So they are the vestige. They're that connective tissue between, they're the first British blues boom band that is wild, right? And basically, so you also have a few other things going on. You have a 4-man lineup with a long blonde haired, good looking guy shrieking away. So you have sort of the start of the heavy metal vocal. But also on the first album, you have sort of, a proto metal classic in Communication Breakdown. You have How Many More Times, and on to the second album, you've got excellent modern heavy metal riffing with Whole Lotta Love, even though it was kind of a lift. But you've got you mentioned Heartbreaker, but Live and Love and Made as well. You've eventually got a Viking song with Immigrant Song, and that's
right.
So that's early. But Led Zeppelin always poo-pooed being called heavy metal. They didn't like it. They thought it was beneath them. So basically, every Led Zeppelin album is like 10 to 40% to 50% maybe hard rock or heavy metal of some sort. They never really grew out of wanting to be, super modern with what they were doing. But every once in a while, they would throw something down that was pretty important, historically, although, so Led Zeppelin 4 is also pretty big with the likes of Black Dog,
yeah.
Like a very, convoluted riff and the frenzied production values and the heaviness of rock and roll. So basically, I guess Zeppelin counts more so for those first 2 records before 1970 even arrives. They do a little more for the cause pretty early. But you got to remember, there are certain guys like Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler and Bill Ward and Ozzy Osbourne who actually love this music and want to give you lots of it. So their records were like 80% heavy metal. And, Led Zeppelin is just like a distant, a distant memory by 1971, even, because Black Sabbath has now given us Black Sabbath, Paranoid, and Master of Reality, right? Deep Purple has done In Rock and Fireball. Uriah Heep is just like kicked ass with the first album with Gypsy and Bird of Prey. And then we're into Salisbury and Look at Yourself. So basically, heavy metal is taken by these other bands and run with it. And Led Zeppelin just basically, they dabbled a little, but they dabbled early. And that's why they're kind of important.
Well, they dabbled in everything.
Yes.
That was the whole thing with Led Zeppelin. They dabbled in everything. I mean, I've heard Jimmy Page refer to the sort of the Zeppelin catalog as sort of the textbook, because there's the folky stuff, there's the acoustic stuff, there's the heavy stuff, there's the bluesy stuff. Like they that was their whole thing. It's like, they have multiple genres in their catalog. Here's a question for you, Martin. Brian is asking, what was Venom considered in terms of the categories of metal?
Yeah, so Venom's a really cool one because they are hard to categorize. So you almost can't put them in any category, but you can put them in a bunch of them too. So they were squarely right there in the middle of the new wave of British heavy metal. They're on Neat Records, Newcastle, all that stuff. So they're right in there doing this thing. But they also can be considered the first black metal band because they were so overtly satanic with the Baphomet on the cover and the super satanic lyrics. They could be considered the first death metal band because they were very, very, on purpose, rough recordings and thrashy, and Kronos's voice was so thrashy. So they're a new wave of British heavy metal band. They're maybe the first death metal band. They're maybe the first thrash metal band. You could put them in this kind of short-lived category of speed metal, along with the likes of Raven and even Iron Maiden to some extent, and a few other of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, and even Motörhead, actually, for that matter. Thrash, they're a little bit, they've got some of the vestiges of thrash. So complicated and rich past. But if I was forced to pick one, I would say they're the first black metal band.
First black metal band. Folks, if you have any questions, please tag me in the chat and I will forward those to you. Okay.
I'm just going to grab water. Keep talking.
No worries. I have a theory, Martin, and let me know if this theory is completely off.
Yeah.
Lemmy. Now, I'm not saying Lemmy had what we call the Cookie Monster vocals, but he did have that sort of gravelly voice. Do
Yeah.
you think Lemmy had anything to do with that style of singing? Was he like one of the sort of not intentionally, but maybe one of the guys that planted that seed that now you have the bands that play and use that vocal style in their singing? Do you think Lemmy was one of the originators of that?
Absolutely, because Motorhead also has that rich, complex history. I mean, a lot of people consider them the first speed metal band, as I mentioned, but maybe even the first thrash band. And one of the reasons is all heavy songs, rough recording, fast. But the other big one is, as you mentioned, his voice. So he's singing really rough. They've got this biker look, this leather look. They look like a super, mean heavy metal band. This crazy power trio, right? Fast Eddie, Filthy Animal, all gone now, which is crazy. I mean, all three of them are dead now.
That's right. Yeah.
I did a Motorhead book on the early days, and I often mention this. It's called Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers: The Rise of Motorhead. When I was writing it, all three of them were alive. By the time I was finished it, all three of them were dead. But
Wow.
yeah, crazy. But no, absolutely. So the line goes from Motorhead through to the likes of Venom and Tank and Warfare, like this dirty new wave of British heavy metal thing. And some other singers were singing pretty rough. But and Metallica loved Motorhead. Obviously.
Yeah.
They picked up a lot from him, the speed, the gruffness in the vocals. But yeah, Lemmy totally is basically probably the first guy of that whole thing. But you had a little vocal fry in even Ronnie James Dio had hints of it. Rob Halford had hints of it. Sammy Hagar even had hints of it. But Lemmy was absolutely your first quote unquote thrash vocal.
All right, this is a really loaded question, but Brian asks a question for you. Ask Martin his famous hard rock, heavy metal, and metal bands if he thinks those four categories are valid. So he's saying hard rock, heavy rock. I don't know what the distinction would be there, but heavy metal and metal.
You mean to kind of define them again against each other? Is that
no?
What he's asking, or my favorite bands in those genres?
Your favorite
albums?
Favorite bands? I think he's talking bands. I think he means bands. Brian, if you don't,
that's funny because heavy rock was like a genre tag that was applied to a lot of bands starting in the early 70s, pretty much. So, Black Sabbath would be my favorite of those. Hard rock bands. So, yeah, that's an interesting, that definition has changed over time, but I would say my favorite hard rock band would be Aerosmith or AC/DC or ZZ Top. I mean, those three bands. ZZ Top maybe doesn't get called that a lot, but AC/DC certainly does, right?
Yeah.
Heavy metal, if we're to use the definition today of like true metal, right? Keep It True Festival kind of definition, I would say Dio. Dio would be my favorite totally traditional heavy metal band. So, yeah, there you go.
So, you mentioned Black Sabbath as being one of your favorite bands. So I came into Black Sabbath a little bit later.
Right.
My introduction to Black Sabbath was the Heaven and Hell record.
Right.
So I came into Black Sabbath when Dio was singing. And to this day, my favorite, usually when you get into something that's what you sort of hold, true to your, hold more true than what comes later, what came before. So for me, my favorite version of Sabbath is with Dio, and that's, bone of contention. But I'll take Sabbath with Dio over Ozzy anytime, and I know that's blasphemy, but that's just
not really, because that's the whole point. As you move along, like other people think the Tony Martin era is their favorite era, and
there you go.
A lot to be said for Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. A lot of people, even who are older, will pick Heaven and Hell as the greatest Sabbath album because as time goes on, like I've heard a lot of young people say, that old Sabbath with Ozzy, it's just a bunch of hippie music. It's not even heavy metal, it's hard rock, like all these weird things, right? So basically you can look at that stuff and think it sounds super, super old. And I'm exactly the same way. I actually don't like very much the very first Black Sabbath album, and I'm actually quite depressed by Paranoid. So those two I don't like very much. So that's me being ageist on the very early Sabbath. So you're right. It totally depends where you come in.
Yeah, like the first Sabbath show I saw was the Mob Rules tour with Dio singing. That was the first show I ever saw with Sabbath.
Cool. Yeah.
And
me too, actually. First Sabbath show I ever saw was because I grew up in a small town, so I didn't see a lot of concerts early on, right?
Ian Luckett's got a question. Could you ask Martin, how do bands like Napalm Death fit into the timeline given their proximity to the metal revolution in the Midlands, UK?
Yeah, so they're an interesting band. I love those guys. Really cool band. They are more like qualified as a grindcore band, right? You could call it, and they're almost like a fancy pants version of thrash in a way. Because they're actually their stuff's actually quite complicated, and it's really extreme. You could even put them a little bit in the death metal category, but their lyrics are much better than death metal lyrics. They're more societal and political and really kind of cool, actually. But yeah, that whole Midlands scene, it's Diamond Head was from there, and ELO, Trapeze, a couple of the Zeppelin guys, Black Sabbath, of course, Judas Priest, of course. So there is this long history there. They're a big part of the Midlands thing. But yeah, they were a grindcore band. Who else is in that from there? Godflesh, those kinds of bands. And then you also had a little bit of a crossover into that. There was that cool Doom era out of there with Paradise Lost and My Dying Bride and Cathedral. I guess they had a little bit of crossover with Cathedral in the early days, now that I think about it. But yeah, Napalm Death are just like, they're legendary. They're an amazing, really cool, smart band, great productions, great playing, just lyrics, everything. Just really cool band.
I should mention, folks, in the links down below, I have a link to Martin's Facebook page. I have a link to Martin's webpage, where and we'll get into this a little, because we haven't really talked about this much, Martin, where you can find one of, if not, well, all of your 85 or to 90 published books. So let's talk a little bit about the books. So I'll leave that up to you. Do you want to talk about something you're working on currently, or is there sort of a couple of standouts that you'd like to
Well, I guess I'll mention the latest one. So yeah, martinpopoff.com. There's basically every book is described. There's PayPal buttons for Canada, the States, international. I sign them and send them out of the office. That's my main income every year, is actually being a mail order guy of my own books, right?
Cool.
So the recent ones are a Saxon book, a Merciful Fate book. I just finished the Iron Maiden trilogy. So there's Where Eagles Dare, Iron Maiden in the 80s, Holy Smoke, Iron Maiden in the 90s, Empire of the Clouds, Iron Maiden in the 2000s. The other recent one is Anthem, Rush in the 70s. So there's a Rush trilogy. The Limelight one is coming out in late October, November. We recently had a Bluish to Cult coffee table book called Bluish to Cult Visual Biography. I'm getting more of those in next week. And we're actually, to mention something we're working on, we're in the middle of getting a Thin Lizzy visual biography done.
Oh, wow.
I'm eventually going to update my Ozzy and Dio books, but that's still a little ways off. So yeah, those are the recent ones. What else? UFO, Bluish to Cult, UFO, Scorpions. These are all the ones that are still in print. Accept is now out of print. What else we got here? They're all behind me here on this side. All that's, it's obviously kind of dark to see, but Van Halen, I got 2 Black Sabbath books, Sabotage, Black Sabbath in the 70s, and Born Again, Black Sabbath in the 80s. Those are both in print. So yeah, out of the 85 or so, it's really only about 50 55 of them maybe that are actually in print. So
Still in
they
print.
they're in print and they go out of print kind of thing. There's all these coffee table books, Rush album by album, Iron Maiden album by album. There's my Led Zeppelin book, all the albums, all the songs, where I have to basically analyze every single song. So yeah, there you go. That's enough to chew on.
There you go. So it's all down there, folks. If you want to check it out, if you're interested in any of Martin's books. Six String Brian is asking, what did Martin think about Slash Puppet in Toronto, the Rock and Roll Heaven days?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, I wasn't here for that, so I wasn't seeing all those bands, but I remember when that album was big, and it was a good late period hair metal album. That's the thing. Toronto never really participated big in the hair metal thing. Not a lot of successes coming out of it. Remember Svengali, Slash Puppet. I don't even remember them all. You think of Meat Magazine. It was hilarious seeing all those ads for all those bands, but I wasn't around to go to all those things. I just moved here in '88 and didn't see a lot of concerts. I remember going to Rock and Roll Heaven a few times. I think did I see Pantera there? Definitely saw Manitoba's Wild Kingdom. Definitely saw Faith No More. Might have seen Soundgarden. I don't know. Maybe not. But yeah, at Kingswood, went to a bunch of Kingswood stuff. And yeah, a few concerts here and there, but I was not, I've never been in the Gasworks. I was never in there. So yeah, Slash Puppet was one of the good ones. Who else was big around then? Who else had albums out? Svengali, I totally remember. But it was pretty thin on the ground, really, honestly. For Toronto did not get into that thing and participate that well. We had Helix, of course.
Yeah, had Helix.
Carry over from the early days, but
you had Sebastian Bach, who left Toronto to go join Skid Row.
Skid Row, yeah. They were good and big immediately, right? They did awesome with the first one. Awesome with Slave to the Grind, right?
Yeah. So let's see if there's any other questions. Folk, if you have any questions, just please tag me in the chat. So you're naming off a bunch of bands, and I said to you off air I was going to ask you this. Why is there no, out of those 85, 90 books, why haven't you done a book on Kiss?
Well, the main reason is there's tons and tons of them already, and super detailed, where they go into granular history, and also I think they've all done autobiographies, if not a couple each, for some of them.
They've all done them, yeah.
The other thing is I generally don't do books unless I've interviewed a band like a good 20 times, like good long interviews and stuff. And I really have, I've never interviewed Gene. I've interviewed Ace a bunch of times, never interviewed Peter, interviewed Paul a couple times, Bruce Kulick, a few other guys here and there, but I just don't have the mass of really good Kiss interviews to say I've got anything new to bring to the table. So that's it really there. I mean, it's overwritten, and I really don't have enough to add to the story.
There's a gentleman named Ken Sharp.
Yeah.
That's written some really well-written, detailed books on Kiss. So yeah. It's there is a lot of stuff out there. You were mentioning interviews. So what is there any interviews, because you've done tons of them for your books and so on. Are there any interviews or any stories from some of the interviews or some of the folks that you've met that kind of, you wouldn't mind sharing with us?
Well, I mean, the favorites are always people like Zakk Wylde was always hilarious. I mean, that guy could have been a comedian, right? And in his drinking days, obviously it was even funnier, right? I suppose, in a way. It's sorry to say, but but being on the bus with Zakk was always great. And Ozzy, we got Ozzy in person interviews. Black Sabbath, Tim Henderson and I, probably our favorite memory is interviewing all 4 members of Black Sabbath in 2 pairs in a hotel room. That was really cool. We did the reunion. But who else big? Alice Cooper. The biggest one I ever did was for my Queen book. It was a phone interview, but I managed to get Paul McCartney to talk to me about Queen for my Queen book. It was pretty cool. That's the top of the food chain. John Paul Jones, that was amazing getting to meet him down backstage at Massey Hall, and did a short interview with him. So that was some rock royalty there. But there's all sorts of people that are just great interviews. Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull is a great guy to talk to. Joe Lynn Turner's always a blast. Bill Ward from Black Sabbath is always just super honest and really emotional. So there's many really cool memories, a lot of in person, but a lot of interviews, maybe a lot of people don't know this, but so many of them happen on the phone. I mean, I've done about 1,800 interviews, maybe 2,000 interviews, and I would say 80% of the time it's on the phone. If I wasn't from Toronto, it'd be even a higher thing. If you're from a small town, you're definitely not getting them in person, right? But so yeah, obviously the fondest memories really are when you do get to meet them in person and sit down with them in person.
Right, right. Well, the questions are coming in now like crazy. So here's another question from Ian. How does Martin see the collision of classical traditions in nu metal impacting the future development of rock?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're referring to actual classical music and the whole thing about power metal and symphonic metal and Nightwish and Rhapsody of Fire and those kinds of bands, I don't even know if that's what your question is about, but there is a lot of that. I mean, classical really did come in at the beginning. Classical music infused rock and went one way to progressive rock and went one way, I feel, to heavy metal. And you think of Dio and Rainbow and all that Egyptian, Middle Eastern tonalities, and Yngwie Malmsteen and power metal and Halloween. And so there's tons and tons of power metal bands doing that. I don't know if that was really your question, though. I'm not too sure.
Well, he's spelling nu metal NU metal. Does that help?
Well, okay, so nu metal is something entirely different that has nothing to do with classical. And I think you might mean classic as in just classic, not classical. Nu metal, I mean, we did a whole episode of that in Metal Evolution as well, and it has a fascinating history. Nu metal is essentially Ross Robinson production values and rap, right? A lot of rappiness and a lot of rhythm and a lot of 7-string bass and a reliance on bass guitar. So nu metal was something that was massive in the early 2000s, with the likes of Korn and Limp Bizkit and who else did we have there? Drained, right? Is that the name of the band? But Papa Roach, all those bands, Kid Rock, even a little bit. Sepultura kind of started it out with those Ross Robinson production values, going to that, and then bands dabbled famously like Metallica or whatever, and even not so much Slayer, but Machine Head definitely. So yeah, nu metal was this kind of short-lived thing that people call rap metal. It's really put down. Creed was a little more the post-grunge thing, and the record sales were obscene. I mean, bands nowadays would be so jealous thinking back to how many records all those bands were selling, right? Yes, multi-platinum all over the place, right?
Yeah, they had their day, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Six String Brian, okay. I was going to ask this question. Well, he's asking it for me. Who was the most disappointing interview that Martin conducted?
Wow. Well, you really get ticked off when you get stood up a few times. So that happens here and there, or when they get mad at you, or they get mad at something in the room or whatever, or they're surly, or they're not really paying attention. So, you get that happening sometimes. Boy, I don't know who was ever cranky. Man. And then you also get ones where, like, you get a lot of attitude from the handlers and the management, and they tell you things you can't ask. You get where they tell you've got 12 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever, and it's like you were thinking you were getting 20 minutes, and all of a sudden, what the heck do I ask? So I don't know. I almost don't want to name names because
that's why I didn't want to ask you.
The reason is that there really hasn't been anybody that was like cranky the whole time, or I've had people get mad at me for asking too much about the old days or something. I mean, Richie Blackmore definitely would change the topic or tell you I don't want to answer that or whatever. So I've had a few where you got like one bad answer or whatever. Glenn Danzig maybe. Glenn is actually he's not a great interview sometimes in a way, because he'll give you really short answers sometimes. So you don't want that to happen too.
Yeah,
Lemmy,
that's tough.
Like that too. Lemmy, and that's the other thing. So you get guys who don't suffer fools gladly, right? So if you haven't done your homework, or if you ask a stupid question, they get mad at you, right? Lemmy can be a little bit like that. So he was always, you had to be on your toes with Lemmy, and definitely you had to make sure you had enough questions, because he could, if he's bored with the question, perhaps he'll just give you a really short answer. And then there's that, delicate silence where you have to come up with something new. But yeah, I don't know. Truly there haven't been very many bad experiences, because you know, you don't want to tick them off either, because you've got to get the job done. You don't want them to hang up on you, because what's the point then? You just wasted the whole setting this whole thing up and you didn't even get your interview done, right? So if you're going to ask anything really bad, you leave it to the end. That's the other thing, right?
You could do that, yeah. Okay. We got a question. I lost it, but I remember the question. It was if you've ever interviewed the Tea Party.
Definitely a few times. Love Jeff. I love that band. You know, the funny thing with them is that I hated that first album, or the second album. There's the first kind of redone as the second. Anyway, Splendor Solace. I found them like super pretentious, and I just, it turned me off. But soon as Edges of Twilight came out, it's like, okay, you're not pretentious. You're actually geniuses. I love you. You guys are amazing. So basically, I worship the Tea Party. I love them. I could even see if they wanted me to do a book on them one day, I'd totally be into that. But yeah, I've interviewed those guys. Nice guys, super smart. Jeff is more than super smart. He's like a dangerous rock and roller. He's just like, he's into literature and all kinds of music, and just kind of mysterious and dark and cool. And yeah, just totally love the Tea Party. But it's funny. It was one of these where like, you guys suck because you just sound like you're so pretentious. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, that's because you're geniuses. So you know, you're excused.
Yeah, they get a pass.
Yeah.
Let's get, this is kind of a strange comedies. This is Half Ace. He's asking, why wasn't Jolyn Turner ever in Sabbath? Seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's funny, and I often have to remind myself that Ronnie James Dio was never in Deep Purple either, right? Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a no-brainer, and I honestly have never heard it ever discussed, right? And yeah, and it's like, why was Ronnie never in Deep Purple either? So yeah, it was such an incestuous bunch of guys, right? So I mean,
yeah, Sabbath and Deep Purple, they did a few exchanges, yeah.
Yeah.
Jesse Adams is asking, Martin, what are your thoughts on the Rods? And ask Martin why he didn't put Budgie on his new wave of British heavy metal.
Okay, so the Rods is a band that I always owned all of those albums, but I was never a massive fan of them, except for the Wild Dogs album. I thought that's where it all kind of came together really good. So it's weird. I mean, I owned all those records all my life, but just was never got to be a massive fan of them. Carl Kennedy's a bit of a buddy, you know, and he did some great stuff. He did some early recording with Anthrax and stuff, so he's been in there in history as well. Did a lot of production. Budgie is a band that started in about 1969 or 70. First album is 1971. But they do actually belong in this thing that I did an episode of my History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff podcast called Honorary New Wave of British Heavy Metal Bands. And Budgie was the band that did the most egregious about-face into total heavy metal for one album, more or less, for Power Supply, from Impeccable 1978 into Power Supply 1980. Night Flight was fairly new wave of British heavy metal. It's got one of the first Derek Riggs artworks on it, right? But no, you can never call them an actual new wave of British heavy metal band because their first record is 1971. They're as old as the very origins of heavy metal itself.
Right. So and along the same lines, Judas Priest would not qualify either.
No, and believe it or not, Judas Priest started in 1969, even though their first album was 1974. So they're as old as heavy metal itself as well.
Right.
But so the bands that were kind of big and participating was basically anybody who was heavy from the 70s is in there like a dirty shirt doing stuff. But if you're actually from the UK, so you have Uriah Heep with Abominog as well. But Budgie, certainly Judas Priest, they're almost considered the godfathers of the new wave of British heavy metal. And a lot of people do loosely put them in with it because, you know, British Steel is so integral to that whole thing. It was just such an iconic record of that time. But even Black Sabbath with Ronnie James Dio is part of it in a way. Even Ozzy Osbourne is part of it in a way with an 80 and an 81 album, right? Even Ian Gillan with the band Gillan, that was like a bunch of old guys, but they were like had a new band that was totally new wave of British heavy metal. So you had old guys participating in various ways and doing well. Scorpions, of course, except you know.
Yeah.
So there are bands, there's the odd number, few bands like Accept, where it's like they're doing everything that would make you think they were part of it. They just happen to be from Germany.
Yeah, yeah. This I don't know if we maybe touched on this question, but Crowbar is asking, what's the wildest thing an interviewee ever did during an interview?
Did? Oh boy. I don't know. I was never part of the fabled, thank God. I mean, I remember Dimebag Darrell used to, plop a full plastic cup of whiskey in front of you and tell you to drink it down or this interview isn't happening. That kind of thing. Like I don't know what I would do. I probably wouldn't even do it, right? But literally, yeah, they would make you get hammered with them to do an interview. So I always thought that was pretty funny. But
That's funny.
there's not a lot of there's no sex going on around, even backstage or on a bus, really. Anytime I did an interview, but no, nothing. Other than being distracted. I've had the odd guy, who I knew was long time married, introduce me to their girlfriend in an interview, and say, "Oh, meet Candy. This is my girlfriend, right?" And then she'd wander off, and you do the interview, and you go, "Okay, well, I hope that doesn't get out. You shouldn't be introducing everybody to Candy here." But no, honestly, I don't have a good answer for that because nothing crazy ever happened.
All right, I got a couple of things to mention. We are at the hour mark. Are you okay to go a few minutes longer?
Longer, sure.
Okay, because another question just popped up for you, Martin. Well, this is I don't know if you were around for these bands because this is local, but Bobby Lopes is asking, does Martin remember the Toronto band Zon or FM with Nash the Slash?
No, because I wasn't here for those. I know those bands somewhat, what they were like and who they were, but no, I wasn't seeing any of that stuff. My first major concert was 1976, Ted Nugent Rex and Bebop Deluxe in Spokane. And then really it was only on vacation from, across the country in the camper van. I remember seeing Kiss and Cheap Trick in Montreal in 77 or early 70.
Wow, that's a show.
I saw Blue Oyster Cult on the Mirrors tour in Poughkeepsie, New York. I saw April Wine in Halifax. But other than that, you really start getting into 1980, 81 when I was off to university in Vancouver and Victoria, where I saw my first concerts. Like you, Walter. I mean, Black Sabbath Mob Rules is one of my very first concerts, actually. And that's like we're into 81 at that point.
Yeah, my first show ever was actually the anniversary just passed was August 4th, 1979 at Maple Leaf Gardens, and I was seeing Kiss on the Dynasty tour.
Cool.
I was 12.
Yeah.
It's like first show ever. I'm in the nosebleeds, but just being in the same auditorium as Kiss, I was like, oh my God.
And the ill-advised capes.
Yeah, but you know what? I tell you, man, if you're a 12-year-old kid, you're seeing your favorite band climbing, like literally that tour, they came out of the stage. They had lifts, and they had like dry ice in there. They had the individual colors, right? Red, green, purple, blue. Yeah, and they come out of the stage, and then they run down the ramps, and they kick into like, what was it? Probably King of the Nighttime World or something. It's like, oh my God. I was like, oh my God. Yeah. That was insane. Cool. Jesse Adams is asking, do you guys like Never Say Die?
I'm a massive Never Say Die fan. I mean, a lot of people don't like it. I mean, it has pretty rough production and the band was obviously falling apart, but I love that, the psychological tension of the falling apart band there. I love Swinging the Chain with Bill Ward singing. I'm a fan of Air Dance and Breakout, Junior's Eyes, Never Say. I mean, there's so many cool different directions on that album. It is very rough and hard to listen to, but I'm just a massive fan of it. I love Technical Ecstasy as well, and Sabotage is my favorite Sabbath album. So the three I play the most from that whole era are those last three.
It's funny you mentioned Sabotage. So, like, the Black Sabbath song, like my first Black Sabbath that I got exposure to was that Greatest Hits. I even forget what it's called. Like Greatest Hits.
I think it was called Greatest Hits. Wasn't it?
Something, I don't know. Anyways, it was the Aussie era, like so that's my exposure to the songs everybody knows. So I never really
sold our soul for rock and roll was
that's the one.
That was the double album with the
that's it. So that was
then in the gatefold, right?
Yeah. And sort of that was it. So, but I never really did a deep dive. And then I was watching, it was one of your banger TV shows where it was like the best records of that year, and it was 70 something. I don't remember what year it was, but I remember you mentioning Sabotage, and I'm like, you know what? I haven't really listened to a lot of early Sabbath records back to back, and I actually listened to Sabotage last night, and holy shit, is that a great record?
Yeah.
I love that record.
Yeah, I rate it my favorite album of all time. Sometimes it's that, sometimes it's Physical Graffiti, sometimes it's Queen One, sometimes it's Dictator's Blood Brothers. But no, Sabotage is usually the one I pick. So
that's a great record. I mean, I would say there's a couple. I think the last song I found, that was the last track of the last two tracks I wasn't really fond of, but Hole in the Sky was fantastic. Is a Megalomaniac.
Yeah.
Holy shit! Like they're just. Yeah, that was that. Yeah. So now I'm thinking I should go back and listen to some more, some of the deeper cuts, the stuff that's not on, We Sold Our Souls, right?
Yeah.
Oh, here's a question. Can you tell Martin to get Pete Pardo into Samson?
He probably is into Samson. I mean, Pete's knowledge just floors me. Like how he can go through entire catalogs of so many different kinds of bands, from every form of classic rock through to the super. He's also a super like heavy extreme metal guy too. But I would be very, very surprised if he didn't know a lot about Samson already.
Yeah. And somebody's mentioning here. Max Webster. That was a great band.
I did a book on Max Webster. It's out of print now, called Live Magnetic Air. Although you can get the ebook of it from Zunior.com, and I even spoke the whole thing in, so you can hear me reading the whole damn book to you for over 10 hours for $20. So you can get the audiobook or the ebook, but the print's out of it. And they are my favorite Canadian band of all time. I love them more than Rush because we always have this debate. There's certain bands that break up before they screw up, before they even can. And so they got a nice tight catalog. I put Max Webster in there, Pantera, The Police, Soundgarden, certain new wave of British heavy metal bands. But Max Webster's catalog is just, I love every album to death that they ever did. So that's why they're my favorite Canadian band of all time.
Yeah. What do you think of the Kim Mitchell solo stuff? A little too poppy for you?
Well, the Kim Mitchell EP I love better than every Max Webster album. It's the greatest EP of all time. I love the first two albums, and then it slowly starts going downhill. I liked Itch, and then I even liked Ain't That Amazing, or is that what it's called? Ain't Life Amazing? I guess the only ones I don't like very much are Oral Fixations and Kemosabe. But I worship the debut. I think Rumor Has It is possibly the greatest guitar solo of all time. I did an episode of greatest guitar solos of my history in 5 songs, and I included that. And the 5 songs on the EP, mind-blowing. Like from the production to the playing to the drumming to Pye's lyrics, everything. Those 5 songs kill everything Max Webster ever did. I mean, those are like literally, if you combine the 2 catalogs, I would almost put those 5 songs as the top 5 songs of the entire combined catalog.
Yeah, you mentioned like his guitar playing. He's one of those guys that never. I mean, it's funny though. Him, Alex Lifeson, Rick Emmett, like those guys are bona fide guitar heroes, but they don't get nearly the amount of attention that they deserve. I don't know. Maybe it's because they're Canadian. I don't know. You know what I mean? But nobody mentions those guys in the same breath as Zakk Wylde that you mentioned earlier. You know what I mean?
Well, part of it's being Canadian, and 2 of those bands didn't do massive in the States. Triumph did okay, but Rush, of course, did do massive. But and Rush is kind of a little bit. Alex is a little over shadowed by the vocalist, the bass player, the drummer, and the lyricist. And the basically the style of music itself and the album covers. I mean, there's so many great things about Rush that poor Alex's guitar playing is kind of left as like, oh, okay, now let's talk about that now, right? But the other reason is, the idea of the elevator pitch, right? The idea that what is a succinct style or stamp or something you can say about this where you go, that is that guy. So a lot of the most famous guitar heroes or famous guitar players have this super identifiable style, and I can name a dozen of those, right? And those guys, really kind of don't, I guess.
Well, in Alex's case, that's what makes him great is the fact that he can do a whole. I mean, Rush's music is so varied, and he's able to play to that and accompany that, and you know, and
Keep
raise it to
talking.
the next level.
I'm going to grab some more water.
Yeah, no worries.
Talking a lot.
Six String Brian is asking, does Martin play an instrument? Yeah, we started off talking about that. Martin,
drums. I was inspired by Peter Criss and Neil Peart, and I bought a nine piece set of Black Pearls because of Peter Criss, and I remember I finally got to meet him in person. I even brought the receipt to show him. I still had it from 81 or whenever it was. And I got some things signed. That was cool. But so I was a okay drummer for a little while there. That's all. And I always owned a guitar and a bass, and I always plunked along, and I could play bass a bit, and I would learn guitar solos and stuff, but I never learned chords. I'm a good rhythm guitarist with bar chords, and that's about it. So,
what are your thoughts on? This is from Jesse. What are your thoughts on Goblin?
Goblin, never paid any attention to them. Don't know much about them, obviously, except for the fact that the Suspiria horror music, the instrumental. Band Goblin, but there's certain bands I don't know really anything about. They're from where? Italy, France, some European country, right?
I have no idea.
You might even be talking about some new heavy metal Goblin that I don't know, because there's also another Goblin too. So I don't know which Goblin you're talking about.
It's too many Goblins to talk about. Here's a question from Hugh Caldwell. Is Martin aware of Scottish metal band Attica Rage?
No. There's way too many bands out. It's hard keeping up with everything, and I sadly haven't been keeping up very, very well. So no, don't know.
Yeah, that's probably a band that Pete Pardo would know, because he's right up on all that, man. When I had him on a couple of weeks ago, we were talking off air, and he's just rambling off, and I'm like, all these band names. I'm like, man, wow, it was crazy. It was crazy. Jesse's thanking you for doing this and answering his questions. Cool.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to listen.
Yeah. Okay, and then there's more. Oh, Hank, my favorite French band is Guhira.
Right.
Oh, Jesse Adams was asking about the old Goblin, so probably the one you were just talking about.
Yeah.
All right. So just scanning here for questions. Bobby Lopes is asking if I'm sure you've heard and know about Saga, right?
Yeah, Saga. I've interviewed them and met them quite a few times, actually. Know them. They have lots and lots of records. Very prolific band. Obviously, they're almost like the pop or pump rock version of Rush, right?
Of Rush, yeah.
And there, and then you've got the baby Rushes in Max Webster and FM or whatever, and then you've got the next bands, Fates Warning, Queensryche, Dream Theater, whatever. But because Rush is the inventors of progressive metal. But so Saga were obviously poppier and a little more song based, but they were also still pretty progressive, and they really had that kind of Toronto vibe about them. I don't know. Pump rock is an interesting term. That's like New England and Balance and Night Ranger and even Journey to some extent. Those kinds of bands. Styx a little bit. Saga fits into that a bit, I'd say.
Here's a question from Six String Brian. Any information about Raven?
Not information. I mean, they're still going. I think they just put out a recent album. Rob is a Facebook friend. I see him all the time. He's always talking. Great band, super influential band. Probably two of the most landmark heavy metal albums of all time come from them, and they're both very different from each other. Wiped Out, the second one, and All for One, the third one. The third one is just beautifully produced. It's slower and crunchier. One of my favorite albums of all time, start to finish, just a masterpiece. And then the first one, Rock Till You Drop and Wiped Out, are very influential in the idea of speed metal, which of course takes us into Anvil. Anvil was super important with Metal on Metal and Forged in Fire. But Raven,
Right.
on Neat Records, very, very fast, and the innovative high vocals, double bass drum, kind of thrashy. So they're, speed metal begat thrash later. So Metallica certainly was bigly influenced by Raven. So yeah, they have a super important place in metal history, and they've been very prolific through the years.
Bobby Lopes is asking if you've interviewed Big Wreck.
Big Wreck, no, never have. They were always on the periphery of the metal stuff we were doing. I don't think we ever really covered them in Brave Words and Bloody Knuckles. I appreciated them somewhat through the years. But no, they were just a little. We didn't get to interview a lot of bands that weren't heavy metal bands.
Right. Here's a good question, and this it's for both of us. Are we excited for the new AC/DC album?
Why don't you go first, Walter?
You know what? I'm nervous about the new AC/DC record because, okay, they're going to go back and they're going to basically mine some of Malcolm's old riffs. And I mean, I'm thinking like if those riffs were that good, they would have already been on AC/DC record. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I'm a little bit nervous. I mean, it's going to be great to, I talked about this actually with Pete a couple of weeks ago, the whole Brian Johnson thing. That there was some funny business going on there. How a guy could have no hearing not no hearing, but have a hearing problem that all of a sudden goes away and now he's able to sing with the band. Something didn't sit right, but that's beside the point. If we're just talking about the record, my feeling is I'm a little bit nervous. I don't expect it. You might have maybe the one or two good tunes, and then I think the rest is going to be filler. That's my guess. What do you think, Martin?
Well, okay, so AC/DC, I have sometimes called them my favorite band of all time. I worship AC/DC. I love almost all their albums. I hated Rock or Bust. I loved Black Ice. So I was so disappointed with Rock or Bust. Having said that, I think you or I probably could sit down and in a day write an amazing AC/DC album. I don't think it's that hard, especially if you're already Angus Young, Stevie Young, some outside writers that we're never going to hear the names of, the producer, whoever, right? I think they could get around the riffs not being great. I don't know why Rock or Bust wasn't that great, but I almost feel like it was just bad luck. Just songs that rubbed me personally the wrong way were on that record because Black Ice was amazing. I loved it. It has to be Brian Johnson. It's great that Brian Johnson is back, and I think he could sing amazing on a record. Whether he can go out and play live, I don't care. I just want a record. I couldn't care less about AC/DC doing another tour. It's not going to kill me if he can't tour, right? I felt the same way about Nazareth after Dan McCafferty actually did a solo album. I thought, well, you could have done another record with Dan. It's not that and Ozzy, the same thing. You can prop these guys up in a studio and make it sound right with all the technology and everything. So I love that it's going to be Brian Johnson. If it wasn't Brian Johnson, I just would wash my hands of it. I wouldn't care at all. I would just be so annoyed. It has to be Brian Johnson. That's number one.
Right.
So I have a feeling. They'll make a record and it'll be better than Rock or Bust and probably not as good as Black Ice. But I love the band so much. I totally want them to make another record.
Yeah. It's funny. Like some. Again, this is something else we talked about a couple weeks ago. How some singers sort of defy aging, and other ones they succumb to it. I mean, and it's going to be the singers that are going to guitar. You can play guitar fairly well till your 60s and 70s, but it's the voice. And there's a couple of guys that just I don't know, they just defy logic. Like one was Rob Halford. He can still belt it out really well. I've seen Priest twice in the last 5 years, and he was just phenomenal. Like, it was great. Another one is Glenn Hughes. That guy's a freak of nature, But then you've got the Paul Stanleys of the world, and maybe the Brian Johnsons. I don't know. That it's just guys just hang it up. it's over. Do a record because you can do it in the
Yeah,
studio, but don't go out.
records. I mean, I think I want 5 more records from all these guys, right? And they can do it. But just stop touring. That's all.
Yeah, yeah. What does Martin think about Voivod?
Oh, love Voivod. They're buddies of mine. I mean, I've interviewed them many times. I actually did a Voivod book years ago, The Art of Michel Worlds Away, The Art of Michel Langevin, which actually had basically a Voivod biography as part of it, right? But it was all his artwork, and that came out years ago. I think he even still has some for sale. It was a hardcover book. It even came out in a German hardcover, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Geniuses, amazing band. They should be bigger than they are, but they are a big cult band anyways. Amazing lyrics. Just like Blue Oyster Cult, they're one of the few bands that has concepts that actually span over albums. But Chewy's doing an amazing job as a guitarist and as a songwriter in that band. Michel's a very unique drummer. Snake's a unique lyricist and singer. I mean, they're just absolutely just a drop dead, super cool band with a lot of variety across the albums. And this latest direction, they have this really sort of a little more note dance and faster progressive feel that kind of went away in the Jason Newsted years, but that was cool in another way as being accessible. Yeah, absolutely one of my favorite bands. I still play them a lot, and really cool, and great to see them win a Juno as well, right? With the last.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Okay, I'm gonna ask one of my moderators, if you wouldn't mind, to put in the link for the YouTube channel Banger TV. If you guys wouldn't mind, look up the channel, grab the link, and throw it in the chat. Because Martin does a lot on Banger TV. I mean, you're pretty much every time I get you're in there.
And we also have a show called The Contrarians that we do, where we used to do that out of our office. We've done some Zoom ones, but basically someone has to have a favorite album by a band that's a weird choice, a contrarian choice, and then you have to argue it. And then we also started a new sub show with the Contrarians called Worst Album Edition, where we talk about the worst album by a band. So we've done Led Zeppelin Presence, Motorhead, March or Die. The other two guys have done, I think, possibly Red Hot Chili Peppers, Slayer. We did Van Halen 3. So yeah, that's our other YouTube show that 3 of us, myself, Nick, and Marco, do called The Contrarians.
So for those of you that don't know, well, okay, I think Brian just threw up the link, folks. If you're not subscribed to Banger TV, you should. Yeah, that is the link for Banger. It's amazing. I mean, there's tons and tons of shows on there. Everything is all music based. It's all heavy metal based. You guys you've done a bunch of the favorite years, the Contrarians thing you just mentioned, the Locked Horns, which I guess that's an older series that you guys were doing. I mean, there's just a lot of information about heavy metal in all genres over all years. I mean, you guys even have shows about discussing like the origin of heavy metal and where it all came from. And I mean, I know you wrote a book on that as well. So there is a ton of stuff. Check out Banger TV. It's absolutely fantastic. And can you, just to talk a little bit about that. How did you get involved with Banger? Now Banger, I'm okay. Could be wrong here, but it's basically that's Sam Dunn's thing, right? That's his creation. Is that?
Yeah. So first, there's Banger Films. So the way I got involved is I wrote that original family tree flowchart thing for the first movie.
Right.
And then I didn't work on a couple movies for them. And then I was full-time in there on the Rush movie, Beyond the Lighted Stage. So going to the office every day for 9 months, I think. And then I was full-time on Metal Evolution there. So again, going to the office all the time. And then I've done a lot of transcribing of their interviews for the Satan doc, the Alice Cooper doc. ZZ Top, I was part of the beginning story part of it. So along the way, Banger started this other thing, this heavy metal TV thing a few years back. And yeah, it's Sam's the boss of it, right? Scott is also, part of it, but Sam is the on-air guy along with 4 or 5 or 6 of us other people, and Sam would have guests and stuff. So we started early on with those ones that were basically looking at the family tree chart and talking about the origins of all the different genres of metal, which is what we did in Metal Evolution, right?
Right.
Icons was another show along the way where we did 6 episodes of a thing on certain people. But Metal Evolution, there were these 12-ish episodes on different genres, and that's what the earliest Banger TV shows were. And then they just started inventing new shows along the way. The ones with the the top 5 albums of the year. What is that called? Overkill Rewind. Overkill Unearthed is the new one. Overkill Unearthed is where we look at just pick an old album from the past and look at that. And I did a typo one there, and I think I've got an Aussie that'll go up at some point, but a bunch of other people have done Alice in Chains and whatnot. And then, the year-end wrap-up. So, they come up shredders, right? So there's a lot of different
the shredders of metal. The one they just did with the drummers was unfreaking believable, man. That was great. I've seen all I seen the guitar ones, and then they did the one with the drums. I thought that was great. Yeah, but definitely check out Banger TV, folks. Check out the links below. My Bluetooth is about to fry here, so and we've had you on for almost an hour and a half. So hang tight for a minute, Martin. I'll say goodbye to you off air. So, folks, I want to thank you all so much for checking out the show. Hopefully, you guys dug this. If you're not subscribed to Banger TV and you can watch all the shows Martin was mentioning, check that out. If you're interested in any of Martin's books, I have his webpage below. Check that out. Check out his Facebook page. And if you want to help support the Guitar Hack channel, below I have links to merch. I've got t-shirts and mugs and all that kind of good stuff. Check that out. There's also a PayPal there. If you don't follow me on Facebook or Instagram, that's also down there. Anything would be very much appreciated. So I want to thank you folks. I want to thank Martin for doing this, man. The show was fantastic. I remember I said that hour would go right by, and it just went right by.
Yeah,
it was great, man. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, and we'll catch you next week. All right, hang tight, Martin. I'll be with you in a second. All right, cheers, everybody. Take care.